ребята, вы это пресса? Да. А вы кто? Вы сами как поделаете. Они там отыскали.
A chess game would imply that there was perhaps more thinking or strategy or skill behind this. What we appear to be seeing is a head of steam erupting in Mr. Prigozhin, an accumulation of an awful lot of stuff, possibly even accumulated stress. So he has seen an awful lot of his employees killed over a protracted period and feels terribly let down by the Russian general staff. So this is an eruption. It may therefore not be a terribly thought through eruption. And the balance of power is firmly at the minute in favor of President Putin and the Russian state, dictating the outcome when they choose to. Having said all of that, this is an enormous shock to Russian politics, an enormous shock to President Putin's regime. And it may be a harbinger, therefore, of much more troubled times for the regime in the future. And honestly, we'll only know when we know. You can't predict these things right now. What has brought this to a head, aside from the, I think, almost traumatic stress of being engaged in Bakhmut for so long, is a Russian military decision, a Ministry of Defense decision, to make organizations like the Wagner Group come under the command of the Ministry of Defense rather than be in some way a partner or a collaborator with it. And that was due to take place on the 1st of July. And I think all of this has accumulated and culminated now in Mr. Prigozhin and his organization effectively mounting a mutiny targeted not directly, at least at President Putin, but at the Ministry of Defense and the Chief of the General Staff of the Russian military. Mr. Prigozhin is obviously a very interesting character. His formative years included a lot of time in Russian jails for theft. He sees himself as a classic Russian hard nut. He became a close favorite of President Putin, famously running the catering for some of his more major events. And in establishing and overseeing and deploying the Wagner Group, he has done things around the world which the Russian regime didn't want to use the Russian military for because it wasn't deniable and they might be held accountable. And it was frankly often illegal and definitely grubby. So he's been a servant of the Putin regime in its darkest corners. And now he's turned on that regime, or at least he's turned on the Russian military. So there is clearly an eruption here. Whatever the straw was that broke the camel's back, and I suspect it was the law suggesting the Wagner Group should be subordinated to the Russian military that Mr. Prigozhin has come to loathe so roundly. But whatever has happened, he now wants to see the removal of the Ministry of Defense and the Chief of the General Staff, both key followers and associates of President Putin. And that puts him at odds with President Putin. What is the response that President Putin takes to this now? Does he feel that he's become so damaged, so exposed by this, that in order to restore his power and his reputation, the only way to do this is to destroy the creature he effectively created, in which case he does have the means to do that, and it would be a big fight, but the outcome I doubt really in question. The third thing is, and for me this would be the critical part of this whole thing, is what do the Russian military fighting in Ukraine do? Do they feel this is somebody else's problem and nothing much changes? Or do they sense that it's all falling apart behind them and they're being left to fight and die for Ukraine when their own leadership and their own military leadership are fighting amongst themselves? If that were to occur, then the Ukrainian military would find it much easier to push on the Russian defensive position because they wouldn't have the will to fight. There is no sign of that happening yet. And I think from President Putin's perspective, the way he calibrates his response will be to make sure that does not happen. It is clear that the fracturing of the regime that sits around President Putin, which people have talked about and speculated about, is very real. And what we're really looking for now is does Prigozhin become a standard bearer and people, whoever they are, bind in behind him in what becomes like a 1917 revolution? That seems pretty unlikely right now. But it will absolutely deplete confidence in President Putin's grip on things. And it will make people think that he can be taken on and replaced. And there are Russians who talk about life after Putin, but that may not be Russians that we're really any more enthusiastic about. But the bit that's missing in all of this is the great bulk of the Russian population is observing this, isn't really very troubled by it, it seems. It's not interrupting its life, and its nature of many is to keep the head down and keep out of the way. If the Russian population as a whole becomes connected to something because they get disturbed about their prospects or their safety, then we're in a very different place.